So I guess it's time for an emergency video, and this is an extremely important one. You've already read the title, you've seen the thumbnail, you've clicked on this video, and it's finally something that we can start talking about in fairly solid terms. Adam Stern reported just a couple of minutes ago, as I'm recording this, that IndyCar and Fox Sports are a couple of days away from announcing that they, meaning Fox Sports, will be the TV provider for IndyCar coverage for the foreseeable future, replacing NBC. Now, this is something that I've talked about freely and openly on these videos and on Twitter, but I got to give a shout out to the members of the DL 500 Club. You guys have known about this for a while. I've been pretty candid on those live streams that I have believed for a long time. In fact, I was telling people as early as St. Pete that I believed that Fox Sports was going to get the IndyCar TV deal, and it looks like we're a couple of days away now from the confirmation officially of this coming together. So if you're not a member of the DL 500 Club, you're missing out on some information that isn't quite ready for public consumption, but I would say is still pretty accurate. And yeah, so obviously a lot to talk about in this video, right? Because this is a pretty surprising move to a certain extent, because IndyCar, prior to signing the deal in 2018 with NBC, IndyCar had been, at least the coverage of the Indianapolis 500, had been on ABC for 50 years, 50 plus years of coverage of that particular race. There had been wide world of sports coverage, and then the actual airings of a specific broadcast tailored to the Indianapolis 500 began in 1965. So a very, very long partnership there, and it appears like NBC's sports partnership with IndyCar significantly shorter, only between for the, at least in terms of controlling the Indianapolis 500 in the entire season. This partnership is only going to have lasted from 2019 through the end of the 2024 season. Though, of course, the origins of the NBC deal began way back in 2009 when Tony George signed a deal to put most of the races on a small, fairly unknown channel called Versus, which was then bought by Comcast and merged with NBC and then became the NBC Sports Network. And then, of course, eventually Network NBC got to broadcast races starting in 2019. So, there's no official details of the deal yet. There's a lot of things floating around there, things which I believe, by the way. I guess I'll throw some of these things out there and, again, put these in the rumor speculation territory, although I think they're fairly accurate given the people I've heard them from. My understanding is that Fox Sports offered more money, potentially as much as double the current around $20 million that NBC is offering IndyCar. Now, as reported first by Marshall Pruitt, there was a report that NBC had counteroffered that particular deal with more network races, potentially putting all of the races on network television for IndyCar going forward, but keeping the monetary side of things the same. Fox, then reported by Tony Donahue this weekend, apparently has countered that offer with not only the money, but also the network races. And that deal, frankly, too good to be true. And it looks like that IndyCar's going to take that deal. Now, there's going to be a lot of panic about this because everybody knows what NASCAR on Fox became over the course of the years, right? It went from extremely innovative coverage, extremely cutting edge, extremely, in some ways, edgy, to almost like an episode of Hee Haw. And if you don't know what that is, your grandparents probably weren't born in the 1930s, and I apologize. So for the Zoomers out there, I would say it turned into an episode of, well, here's the comparison. NASCAR on Fox kind of became the Ricky Bobby version of NASCAR, and it's kind of been that for a little while. Now, that being said, there's some great people who work for NASCAR and Fox, right? Mike Joy has done a great job, and the booth that they currently have with Clint Boyer and Kevin Harvick's really starting to come into its own. But NASCAR and Fox have had some issues over the last few years. And it's not just the fact that the coverage has gotten a little bit less hardcore or a little bit less focused. It's become NASCAR has signed a new TV deal, which includes new providers such as Amazon and returning Turner Sports under the TBS banner. And Amazon is taking two of the Fox races away. Now, Mike Joy, in previous statements that he's made on Twitter, has mentioned that the NASCAR Cup Series broadcasts cost the Fox network upwards of $20 million a show, upwards of $20 million a race. So why does Fox push for practice and qualifying with NASCAR broadcasts, and why are they potentially upset that they're losing two big races, including the Coca-Cola 600 on Memorial Day weekend? Well, that's why. They spend a tremendous amount of money on this particular property, that property being NASCAR, and even funded an auxiliary show on their Fox Sports 1 network. That was called Race Hub. Now, kind of ironically, and I don't think unintentionally, Race Hub, right before this broke, yesterday aired their last episode. NASCAR Race Hub is no longer a thing. And unfortunately, the upwards of 70 employees, based on my understanding, that Fox Sports employed, many of whom go back to the Speed Vision days at Fox, have been let go. So the last vestiges of Speed Channel, to quote Grand Moff Tarkin to a certain extent, have been flittered away. It's gone. Speed Vision. Finally in the dirt. So you might be asking, well, why would A, Fox take on IndyCar, and B, how would IndyCar be broadcast on Fox if they have gotten rid of all of their full-time racing people? Well, the first answer to the first question is that Fox has this money to spend, and they have it to spend on auto racing, and pretty clearly IndyCar is a cheaper property to get a hold of and get the rights to than NASCAR, number one. And if you can get the entire IndyCar series, which includes the Indianapolis 500, which is the second highest rated from a TV rating perspective race in the country, behind, another Fox Sports property, the Daytona 500, which takes place when everybody's snowed in, and it gets an incredible TV rating every year of around 9 million people. The Indy 500 is at about 6. So Fox Sports looks at NASCAR kind of turning away from them to a certain extent. I'm sure they see the negative comments. I know they see the negative comments about their NASCAR coverage. They lost the Xfinity Series as well. That certainly opens up some budget. And they've gotten rid of their in-house production staff for auto racing. So they have a great opportunity to take the two biggest auto racing properties and bring them in-house. Makes a lot of sense. Now, how would Fox produce IndyCar broadcasts despite the fact that Fox has gotten rid of all their racing people? Well, if you didn't know, I'm going to tell you how the cookie's made. IndyCar has produced their own broadcasts, essentially from the beginning of the series, which, if you consider this series the Indy Racing League, we're talking about 1996. But the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and IndyCar have their own production company. It's called IMS Productions. And they are the chefs. They bake the broadcast. They create the broadcast. They send the broadcast to NBC or Peacock or ABC or whoever's broadcasting the race, and then ABC or NBC or Fox puts it on there. Now, the difference that a network makes is twofold in terms of what they contribute to what the broadcast is and what the broadcast looks like. I referred to IMS Productions as a chef. So if you think about a chef is only as good as what someone at the table orders for them, right? And so it depends how much freedom you give this chef. I think IMS Productions is an amazing company, by the way, especially when they have creative freedom. I think you should go back and watch a lot of those, 2009, 2010, 2011 IndyCar broadcasts on the Versus Network. They're extremely rewatchable, very, very detailed. They're very enthusiast-oriented. They're excellent TV broadcasts. The most rewatchable IndyCar content, I would say, since the Paul Page, Uncle Bobby, Sam Posey broadcasts of the early 90s. And the reason for that, I think, is because there's a lot of people within IndyCar and within the IMS walls who actually understand the product, believe it or not. It makes a lot of sense, right? And when they're given free reign and a budget to do what they actually need to do, they do a damn good job. The problem, of course, comes when the network thinks they know better than the people that actually know what the hell they're talking about. And so I noticed this over the course of NBC's broadcasts. As NBC began to spend more money and get more involved, they began to take more control over the creative side of things, right? And so I noticed that NBC became much more NASCAR focused. The Indy 500, in many ways, is almost a promotional arm for the start of the NBC NASCAR season. You notice the pit reporters are virtually all NASCAR people. Not all, but a lot of them are. They bring in a lot of NASCAR personalities to be the analysts for the race. Not the actual color commentators, but the guys on the Peacock pit box, the guys roaming pit lane. It's all NASCAR. That's because NBC spends more money on NASCAR than they spend on IndyCar, and then they look at IndyCar and they say, we've got this big property, we can spin it up to become IndyCar. But in the early days of NBC Sports Network, in the Versus days, they brought IndyCar experts in to talk about IndyCar. You got Jan Beekes, you got Robin Miller, you got Lindy Thaxton, you got these folks who knew what they were talking about, cared about the series, and wanted it presented in the right way. Kevin Lee has been someone who's weathered the storm for the longest time there. So Jack Arute would be another one I would shout out. So the question mark of whether this is going to be a good broadcast or not is solely down to Fox. How much, does Fox want to spend to update the graphics, get better data, bring it up to more of an F1 level, right, in terms of the watchability of the broadcast? The second question will be, how much corporate meddling is there? Are we going to have Kyle Petty? Are we going to have Darrell Waltrip? Are we going to have Michael Waltrip? You know, it's cool if they're involved in some way, but you don't want to put them on the pit box and have Michael Waltrip talking about, I can't believe this, the cars are going so fast. You know, you don't want that in the broadcast for an IndyCar race. It would be whiplash. It would be culture shock. It wouldn't make any sense. That's going to be the question mark of whether or not the broadcast is good or not. How much does Fox choose to meddle? What should concern you is that Fox is spending a lot of money to do this, to put this broadcast on. So therefore, because they're doing that, they're going to think that they should be the ones in creative control and decide, make edicts about how the coverage is and what is shown and what is not shown and how it's presented and how it's not presented. And potentially it might clash with people who actually know and understand the property. I hope it's not that way, but I guess this would be my way to implore to the folks at Fox, try to get some experts in there, consult with some people who understand and love IndyCar, and figure out a way to get the broadcast, the best broadcast for the fans. I think that's what I want to advocate. The second thing that is almost like a wash, I would say, between NBC and Fox is that the streaming is going to be different. Now, ideally, I think because IndyCar is such a niche property, they would go back to streaming the practices and qualifying sessions for free on the internet to as many people as possible and use that as a promotional arm to try to get people to tune into the races on TV. But I would sincerely doubt that you will see that happen for a variety of reasons. I think that what you will see is IndyCar qualifying and practice and Indy Next races on FS2 primarily, mainly because people who don't necessarily understand where the world is headed from the perspective of how young people consume content will look at the number that you can very easily Google about how many households Fox Sports 2 is in, and that number reads 52.4 million. Now, if you do more research, you would notice that the highest rated broadcast ever on FS2 was UFC fights, which got 500,000 viewers, the best on that channel. And of course, if you look on the IndyCar YouTube channel, you will notice some practice and qualifying days from the Indy 500, 5 or 6 years ago that were streamed live on YouTube would have about that number. And they would actually be people who are interested in consuming the product and not just TV people. I can also say this about FS2 is that I have lived in households that have had DirecTV, Xfinity, Spectrum, all sorts of different options and opportunities. I don't think I've ever had a TV service that has gotten me Fox Sports 2. So I guess I haven't lived in one of the 52 million households that they claim FS2 is in. Um, but I wouldn't say this is necessarily like a totally bad thing, right? There are some things that are concerns for sure. But I think the opportunity, if it is true that every race is going to be on network television, I think that's good. I think the fact that Fox is kind of checked out of NASCAR for a little while, or a little bit past the Daytona 500, it almost could work in reverse for IndyCar, where the minute the Daytona 500 is over, you're going to see NASCAR predominantly on FS1 and IndyCar races on Big Fox. That isn't the worst thing in the world, I think. And you've got potentially Fox kind of invigorated because they've got a new sports property, and in particular the Indianapolis 500 that they can promote. To anybody surprised about this, I should have probably said this off the top. The fact that NBC didn't announce that they were extending at the Indy 500 was a bad sign. A worse sign was the fact that Lee Diffie is going to cover NASCAR races for NBC at the end of the season, particularly post-Olympics coverage. And, just none of the positive momentum was heading NBC's way. And frankly, I thought the last straw for me, at least in terms of like, well, there's no way they're going back, was the idea that the opening round of the French Open would take precedence over the Indianapolis 500 if it got delayed to Monday. I thought that was one of the craziest things I've ever heard. The potential of the Indy 500 on USA Network is asinine. So it's disappointing that NBC seems this partnership is going away. But there were some things with NBC that I think were definitely worth criticizing. Peacock, I don't think, was a great streaming service. Try to rewatch a race on there, and you're just inundated with ads. It's not very good. Just gonna say it. I think that their coverage kind of strayed away from what made the initial Versus and NBC Sports Network stuff so good, which was a very heavy emphasis on IndyCar and a focus on getting experts in there who know what they're talking about. And more of a focus to turn it into a teaser for NASCAR and then kind of forget about it the rest of the year. So hopefully, from a positive perspective, hopefully Fox wants to commit to this thing full season and interest doesn't fall off after the Indianapolis 500. But there's a lot more questions we'll have answered, obviously, as this is actually formally announced. Obviously it's going to be one of the biggest talking points in IndyCar going forward. And then, of course, the question is, and I'm sure you've already answered this one in the comments, is what will happen with that additional money? Does that go into the leader circle to make the charters more attractive? Does that go into promotion? Does that go into something else for IndyCar? Maybe developing a new chassis or new rules formula that's desperately needed at this point. There's a lot of things that could be done with $40 million a year from a TV company. So we'll have to see. This could be very positive for IndyCar, although I think a lot of people are going to be negative, and I understand why. Thank you guys so much for watching, and obviously we'll be tracking this as this thing develops. We'll see you in the next video.